The night my father told me I was an accident, I was standing on a sidewalk holding a cardboard box. It was late. The street was amber under the halogen lamps. I had my grandmother's quilt tucked under one arm, the one she'd sewn from scraps of old flannel and house dresses, and a square of my childhood Halloween costume, and a box of paperbacks and old letters under the other. My father was standing 4 feet away telling me that my entire existence had been a disruption he never recovered from. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. By that point, something inside me had gone completely still. Not broken. Still. The way a lake goes flat and quiet before a storm moves in. I got in my car. I drove. But none of that moment makes sense without the years that built it. And the years built it slowly, the way water carves stone. You don't see it happening. And then one morning you look, and the whole shape has changed. I was 26 years old, sitting cross-legged on the reading rug in my second-grade classroom in Clarksville, Tennessee, when my phone buzzed in the pocket of my cardigan. It was a Thursday in November. My kids were at their tables working on a counting worksheet, small illustrated clusters of apples, buttons, stars, and the room smelled like glue sticks and the lavender diffuser my co-teacher kept on the windowsill. I almost let the call go. Unknown number. But something moved my hand. A man's voice. Careful and measured. The way voices are when they are carrying something heavy and don't want to drop it. He asked if I was Celeste Renée Hartwell. Nobody called me by my full name except my grandmother. She used it in a mock scolding voice whenever I tracked mud into the kitchen, always while she was already smiling. I said yes. He told me his name was Frank Delacroix. Attorney. He told me there had been a collision on Highway 72 outside of Chattanooga. He told me my grandparents, Walter and June Hartwell, were gone. I remember staring at a paper caterpillar pinned to the bulletin board beside the window. Green, painted with little white dots. One of my students had made it that morning with enormous concentration. I stared at it for a very long time. After that, the afternoon blurs. Honestly, when I think about what it felt like to hear those words, I don't know how to explain it to someone who hasn't lost the person who made the world feel safe. It wasn't grief yet. Grief came later. In the first moment, it was more like the sound of a door closing in a room you didn't know you'd been standing in your whole life. And now the door was shut. And the room was still. And you were still inside it. Here's what you need to understand before I go any further. From the outside, my family looked assembled. My father, Martin Hartwell, sold insurance packages to mid-sized corporations out of an office in Nashville and drove a car that cost more than my annual salary. My mother, Sandra, organized the neighborhood garden tours in spring and attended the arts gala every fall, not because she loved art, but because the gala was where the right people went. My older brother, Colton, had learned to be charming the way some kids learn to play piano. Early, effortlessly, like it was already in him. I was the other one. Quiet. Bookish. I asked too many questions about things my parents found irrelevant. At the dinner table I was largely decorative. I existed in the periphery, while Colton said something about a client, lunch or a golf handicap, and the whole table leaned toward him like flowers following a window. I once tried to tell them about a student in my class who had finally cracked reading that week after months of struggle, and my mother said, "That's sweet, see," in the tone you use to end a conversation rather than begin one. I had one place in the world where I exhaled completely. My grandparents' house. Walter and June Hartwell had built Hartwell Transport and Logistics from a single leased truck and a hand-drawn route between Chattanooga and Atlanta. My grandfather had a 10th grade education and a work ethic I can only describe as quiet and ferocious. He started the company in his late 30s after years of driving other people's routes, saving everything he earned, sleeping in the cab to avoid motel bills. My grandmother kept the books on a folding table in the spare bedroom. 20 years later, they had a fleet of 43 trucks, a warehouse, and a reputation that had outlasted 2 recessions. Their house was small and a little lopsided and smelled like coffee and wood smoke. My grandmother grew tomatoes along the back fence every summer, staked them with care, tied them with strips of old cloth. My grandfather had a workshop where his tools hung in order by size, and when I was small he would let me hand them to him one by one while he explained what each was for. He never talked to me like I was a child, even when I was 1. He talked to me like someone whose opinion he was genuinely waiting to hear. My father was embarrassed by them. He never said it outright. He didn't have to. He called the neighborhood out past the ridge with a particular flatness. He made quiet comments at Christmas about their old truck in the driveway, about my grandmother clipping coupons at the kitchen table before a grocery run. When my grandfather tried to show him something he'd repaired in the workshop, my father would glance at it and check his phone. What nobody said out loud. My grandparents had funded my father's adult life. The down payment on our house, a business loan, co-signed by my grandfather without hesitation, that nearly ruined them both when my father's company hit a rough stretch. 2 other loans after that, quietly made, quietly forgotten by the person who received them. They caught him every single time. He never thanked them. He never even acknowledged it. My grandmother never mentioned it to me. My grandfather would just go back out to the workshop and keep fixing things. I drove to their house every Sunday for 9 years. I never missed one unless I was sick. We ate dinner at the same oval table. We watched football. My grandmother taught me to make biscuits from scratch, to sew a straight hem, to look a person in the eye when they spoke to you like their words were worth receiving. My grandfather taught me that the people who work the hardest are usually the ones who get noticed least, and that a leader worth following always starts by noticing them first. When I told my parents I wanted to teach, my mother set her fork down the way she did when she was composing herself. "Celeste," she said, "you have options." My father said, "We're not paying for that." And they didn't. My grandparents paid every semester without making it into a production. My grandmother sent me a card the week I started my education program. In her looping, unhurried cursive, "We are so proud of you. The children you teach will carry something of you with them their whole lives. You won't always see it, but it will be there." I kept that card in my wallet for 8 years. I still have it. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know some of you reading this have been in a family where you felt like background noise, where the room had a gravitational center that you just weren't part of, where you learned early to make yourself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. If you know what it's like to sit at a table full of people who look right through you, I need you to stay with this story, because it goes somewhere I couldn't have predicted, and I think you need to hear it. The funeral was everything my family was: polished, practiced, hollow. My mother wore black that she had clearly bought for the occasion. My father gave a eulogy that was half tribute to my grandparents and half tribute to himself. Colton stood in the receiving line, accepting condolences, with an expression I can only describe as borrowed grief. Extended family I hadn't seen in years filled the pews and said that Walter and June were wonderful people, which would have been more moving if any of them had made the drive to Chattanooga in the last decade. I stood near the back and cried. Nobody came to stand next to me. 2 weeks later, I sat in the 4th-floor office of Frank Delacroix in downtown Chattanooga, watching the Tennessee River move slowly below the window. My father sat with his legs crossed, the posture of a man who had already mentally spent the money. My mother's hands were folded in her lap, nails painted deep burgundy. Colton kept glancing at his phone under the table. I was staring at the wood grain of the conference table, trying to trace it with my eyes and not fall apart. Then Frank said, "The entirety of the estate, including all shares of Hartwell Transport and Logistics, the property at 2204 Creekside Lane, and all investment and liquid accounts, estimated at approximately $31 million, is left in full to one individual." He looked up. "Celeste Renée Hartwell." The room tilted. My father said, "Run that back." Very quiet, very controlled. Frank did not run it back. My mother's composure fractured first. She said, "This is not right," and there was nothing gracious left in her voice. My father started talking about mental competence, about undue influence, about a quiet daughter who had been filling their heads with who knows what every single Sunday for years. Frank let him finish. Then he said simply, "They recorded something for you." And he turned his laptop around. My grandparents were sitting on the old couch with the faded blue slipcover that I had pressed my back against 1,000 times. My grandfather had his hand over my grandmother's. They looked older than I'd been letting myself notice, but their eyes were clear, and steady, and absolutely present. My grandfather looked at the camera and said, "If you're watching this, then we're gone. I hope the service wasn't too long." June picked out what we'd be wearing, so at least we went out looking decent. My grandmother elbowed him. I laughed through tears I hadn't known were falling. We made this decision with clear eyes and full hearts, my grandmother said, looking directly into the lens. We thought a long time about what it means to leave something behind, and we came to understand that it doesn't mean money, it means values. It means who carries you forward. My grandfather cleared his throat. Martin and Sandra, we love you. You are our children. But there is a difference between love and trust. We spent many years learning that difference. We watched how you treated this family, how you treated this money, how you treated people who had nothing to offer you in return. We saw you. My grandmother looked into the camera without blinking. And we saw Celeste. She came every Sunday. 9 years. She sat with us. She laughed at your grandfather's terrible jokes and helped me with the garden and called just to call. She never asked for anything. She never asked for this. That is exactly why she gets it. The screen went dark. I will not describe in full what happened in that room after the video ended. I'll just say it was not brief and it was not quiet. My father used words I won't repeat. My mother wept in a way that had nothing to do with grief. Colton looked at me with a contempt so undisguised it was almost clarifying, like a fog finally lifting to show you exactly what the land looked like all along. They summoned me to my parents' house that evening. I went. I want to be honest with you about that. Some part of me still believed something could be saved. Some bruised, exhausted part of me kept choosing them, even after years of evidence that they had never really chosen me. I think many of you reading this know exactly what that pull feels like. The hope that keeps rebuilding itself in the dark. The door you keep knocking on even after you've heard what's on the other side. My father had papers spread across the coffee table. Transfer of administrative authority. They would manage the estate. I would receive, he used this exact phrase, a generous allocation of 15%. My mother framed it as protection. You're a school teacher, Celeste, she said. Not unkindly. The way you'd state a medical fact. You cannot run a company of this size. This is us taking care of you. I sat with those papers. I thought about my grandmother's voice on that screen. She never asked for anything. That's exactly why she gets it. No, I said. What followed was not a conversation. My father escalated in stages: first appeal, then pressure, then threat. Colton said things, I'll let stay in that room. And then my father went quiet in the particular way he went quiet when he was done persuading and had moved to punishment. He told me that if I walked out of that house without signing, I was finished. No calls, no holidays. Dead to him. Those words, dead to him. I picked up my bag. I stood. Honestly, and I mean this, I don't know how I walked through that door. Some part of me was screaming to go back, to sign whatever they wanted just to make it stop, just to make one of them look at me the way they looked at Colton. I think if you've spent your life trying to earn a love that was always just out of reach, you understand that pull in your body, not just your mind. It's not weakness. It's just what years of hoping does to you. But I had heard my grandmother's voice that afternoon. I walked out. 50 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A formal notice from a property management company, Meridian Holdings, LLC, informing me that my lease was being terminated effective immediately and I had until midnight to vacate. I pulled into a gas station and sat there in the dark, staring at the screen. I didn't understand it. I Googled the LLC. The registered agent was my father. He had owned my apartment building for 6 years, routed through 3 shell companies. I had been paying rent to him and never known it. There it was. I went back to my apartment. I packed what mattered. Books, the letters my grandparents had sent over the years, the quilt my grandmother sewed when I started college, pieces of her house dresses, my grandfather's old flannels, a square of worn flannel from a shirt of his I'd loved as a child. I folded it carefully. I carried the box to my car. My father was on the sidewalk. He told me I had been an accident. He told me the family had been whole before I arrived, and everything since had been complicated by my presence. He said it without raising his voice. That was the part I couldn't shake afterward, not the words themselves, but the calm. Like he'd been waiting a long time to finally say it without consequence. I got in my car. I drove through the dark toward Chattanooga. Past fields and highway rest stops, and long empty stretches where there are no lights, and you're just moving through black. I didn't have a plan. I had my grandparents' address, and their key on my ring from 9 years of Sundays, and the knowledge that their house was mine. I let myself in at 2 in the morning. The house smelled exactly the same. Coffee and wood smoke and something faint and floral, my grandmother's hand lotion, still on the bathroom shelf. I sat down on the couch with the faded blue slipcover, and I let myself fall apart in a way I hadn't allowed anywhere with other people watching. I cried until I was empty. Then I slept. Frank Delacroix was on the porch at 7 in the morning, with 2 coffees and a paper bag from the bakery 2 streets over. He said he tried my phone through the night, and when I didn't answer, he figured he knew where I'd ended up. He came inside. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where my grandmother used to roll biscuit dough on Sunday mornings. He opened a folder. Then another. And then he showed me what my grandparents had spent 4 years quietly building. Financial records. My grandmother's journals, meticulous, dated, unhurried, documenting every loan my father had taken and never repaid. 3 loans over 12 years. One alone. $214,000. Co-signed by my grandfather 5 years ago, concealed from my father's own business partners. Email copies. Text screenshots. A handwritten note in my grandfather's blocky print. If something happens to us before this is resolved, Frank will know what to do. They had seen it coming. Then Frank opened the security footage. 2 days after the funeral, my parents had used a spare key to enter the house. My mother walked directly to the hallway bookshelf, slid a false panel in the lower section, and opened a small fireproof lockbox hidden behind it. She lifted out my grandmother's pearl drop earrings, the ones June wore every Christmas, every Easter, every Sunday I could remember. She took the garnet brooch. She took a gold locket that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, brought over from the Caribbean when the family first came north. My father stood at the living room window the entire time, arms crossed, watching the street. My grandparents had installed that system because they were afraid of exactly this. They had thought of everything. Medical certifications of full mental competency, signed within months of their deaths. Affidavits from their doctor, their pastor, their neighbor of 28 years. They had built a fortress, and then, before they left, they had handed me the keys. Over the days that followed, they arrived. The people my grandparents had trusted. The ones who had been quietly standing by, waiting for the moment to step forward. Iris, my grandmother's closest friend of 30-some years, showed up with 2 casseroles and a second journal she'd been keeping on June's behalf. Every phone call my grandmother had made to her in the last 4 years. Documented. Miguel, who had worked the fleet garage for 2 decades, who told me quietly that he'd overheard my father on the phone once, years ago, saying my grandfather was a stubborn old man just biding his time. Raymond Okafor, my grandfather's business partner for 15 years, who spread the financial records across the kitchen table, with the quiet fury of a man who had watched someone steal from his friend and been unable to stop it. And Clara Weston, a retired state court judge who had grown up 4 houses down from my grandparents and who arrived in a blazer and said simply, "Your grandfather called in every favor I owed him the day I passed the bar. I've been waiting a long time to return it." I sat at that table and felt something I hadn't felt in years. I was not alone. My family arrived the next morning. All 3 of them. They were expecting to find me exhausted and isolated and small. They were expecting the version of me from my parents' living room, the version that absorbed things, that went quiet, that eventually signed. My father had his confident posture on, the one he used with clients. Colton had his phone in his hand like a prop. My mother had composed her face into something that was meant to look reasonable. They stepped through the doorway and found a kitchen table full of people. My father's eyes moved around the room. Frank, who he recognized. Raymond, who he recognized and whose presence he clearly had not calculated for. Clara Weston, who he didn't know but whose stillness registered as something he hadn't prepared for. He composed himself quickly. I'll give him that much. He pointed at me and called it a circus. He said I was being manipulative. He said he wanted to speak to me alone. Frank said, quietly, that he was happy to proceed however I preferred. I said, "We're fine here. I want to slow this moment down for you. I want you to stay inside it with me, because I have thought about it many times in the months since, and I need you to understand what the room felt like." My grandmother's blue coffee mug, the one with the chip in the rim that she always said she was going to replace, was still in the drying rack beside the sink. The tomato plants were visible through the window, bare in November now, just wooden stakes and dried vines. Everything in that room was hers. Her smell was still in the walls, her handwriting was still on the notepad on the counter, a grocery list she'd never finished, and I was in the middle of it. And every person at that table had loved the same two people I had loved, and had chosen to stand up and say so when it cost them something. My father tried to pivot to the estate. He used the word family several times, the way people use a tool they know is worn out but can't stop reaching for. Raymond placed the loan documentation on the coffee table without a word. My mother's voice began to rise. Clara set her hands flat on the table and said nothing, which was somehow the loudest thing in the room. Then, Frank turned the laptop around. The security footage played. My mother went completely still. My father said nothing. Colton, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, had nothing to say. The room held its breath. I looked at my father across that table, the authority figure I had spent 30 years trying to reach. The man whose approval I had chased, the way you chase something that keeps moving just ahead of you, just out of reach until one day you realize it never intended to stop. I saw him, maybe for the first time, without the frame I'd always placed around him. Not an authority figure, not a verdict on my worth, just a frightened man who had run from the wrong things for a very long time and was now standing in the room where the bill had finally come due. I said, "You didn't come here to protect me. You came here because you were afraid I would become someone you couldn't manage. You spent my whole life making me feel like I was too much and never enough at the same time. But the two people in this world who knew all of us who watched this family for 50 years with clear eyes chose me. Not because I was impressive or polished or the kind of person who knows how to work a room. Because I showed up. Because I sat with them. Because I loved them without needing anything back." I paused. The room was very quiet. I said, "I think some part of you knows what that says. And I think that's the part that scares you most." He had no answer. My mother was crying. I don't know, even now, whether it was grief or loss or something closer to shame, but it looked different from the weeping in the attorney's office. It looked like it might have been real, somewhere below all the layers. They left. The door closed behind them. The room exhaled in a way that felt like something physical, like a held breath finally released after a very long time. What followed was work. Real, complicated, unglamorous work. Frank guided me through the legal process with the patience of someone who had been waiting to do exactly this. Raymond walked me through the company not because he expected me to run operations, but because, as he put it, the kind of leader your grandfather was believed you couldn't truly respect the work until you understood what it cost the people doing it. I learned what it means to manage a fleet. I learned what a week away from home costs a driver in terms of sleep, in terms of their children's school plays and sick days and ordinary Tuesday nights. I learned why my grandfather had always kept a coffee pot on in his office, and a door that was never actually closed. I found in a filing cabinet in the workshop what my grandparents had been quietly drafting for 2 years. The bones of a foundation, the Walter and June Hartwell Community Fund, scholarships for first-generation college students in rural Hamilton County, school supply grants for underfunded classrooms across the district, an after-school arts fund because my grandmother had always said that music and theater and paint were how quiet kids found their voices, and she had always worried about the quiet ones. I put $8 million into it in the first year, and I kept teaching. I want to be clear about that. I kept showing up every morning to 22 second graders who were learning to read, and learning to share, and learning that school was a place where someone was genuinely glad they came. The money changed what I could do for them. It did not change why I was there. When a kid came to school in shoes worn through at the sole, I could do something about it. When a girl in my class showed a gift for drawing that her family couldn't afford to develop, we could change the story. The money was not mine to keep. It was mine to move. I live in my grandparents' house now. It still smells like coffee and wood smoke. The tomato plants come back every summer along the back fence, right where June staked them. My grandfather's tools are arranged in his workshop exactly as he left them. And I have not moved a single one. I don't think I ever will. On Sundays, the kitchen table is full. Iris, who brings too much food and laughs too loud, and those are both entirely the right amount. Miguel, who taught me last fall how to change my own oil because he said my grandfather would have wanted me to know. Raymond and his wife, whose kids have started calling our Sunday dinners homework for grown-ups. Frank, who has become something like a surrogate uncle in the way that only happens when someone shows up consistently and without agenda. Teachers from my school, neighbors. A rotating, chaotic, deeply imperfect collection of people who loved the same two people I loved, and who chose to keep showing up for each other after they were gone. These dinners are nothing like the dinners I grew up in. Nobody is performing. Nobody keeps score. We argue about football, eat too much, say things that aren't as funny as we think they are, and laugh anyway. We tell stories about Walter and June until the stories start to feel like they're still here, which, I've decided, is exactly what stories are supposed to do. There's something nobody tells you about being the quiet one in a loud family. You spend so long wondering what's wrong with you that you forget to ask what's wrong with the room. I used to think my grandparents loved me because I showed up every Sunday. I understand now that I had it backwards. I showed up every Sunday because they were the only place in my life where I didn't have to perform in order to belong. They didn't create that loyalty. They just made space for it. And a person who is starving for space will find their way back to it every single time, no matter what it costs them. That's the thing about Walter and June that took me the longest to understand. They weren't strategic. They weren't building leverage. They weren't keeping score. They just chose, over and over again, to be people worth returning to. And over 40 years, that choice compounded into something no courtroom could undo. I think about that a lot when I'm standing in front of 22 second graders first thing in the morning. Some of them come in carrying things that are too heavy for their size. You can see it in the way they sit down carefully, like they're trying not to spill something. I can't fix what happens before they walk through my door, but I can make sure that for 6 hours a day, they are somewhere that does not require them to earn their place. That's not a small thing. My grandmother taught me that. It took 30 years and a courtroom in Chattanooga for it to fully land. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, not a lesson, just something I keep coming back to, it's this. The people who made you feel small were not telling you the truth about your size. They were telling you the truth about their fear. My father looked at me my entire life and saw someone he couldn't control. He called that a problem. My grandparents looked at me and saw the same thing. They called it an inheritance. Same person, same room, completely different vision. You are not the sum of how the wrong people saw you. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely, not as a formality. Think of one person in your life, living or gone, who made you feel like you didn't have to shrink to fit. Someone who just made room. Leave their first name in the comments. That's it. Just a name. You don't have to explain why. I'll read every single one. And I think this comment section is about to become something worth scrolling through. And if you're watching this late at night, maybe somewhere quiet while everyone else is asleep, tell me where you are. There's something about knowing this found you at the right moment that matters to me more than the algorithm ever will. If this story stayed with you, the subscribe button is right there. Not because it helps the channel, though it does, but because the next story I'm about to tell makes this one look like a warm-up. You don't want to miss it cold. This is a fictional story, inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined, set in Chattanooga and Clarksville, Tennessee, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental.